glad you can make it today because we are continuing the story of David, who is on his way to becoming king. And in fact, he is already king in God's eyes, but his actually inheriting the kingdom of Israel is an ongoing process. And it starts physically for the people when David kills Goliath, and now he has come to the attention of the people as well as King Saul. Now, I was thinking before that David was seeing the killing of Goliath as a possible way to get into the royal family, but it wasn't as easy as that because there are a few steps that take place. Now, uh, David has shown himself to be capable of being a good fighter, and that leads to the first problems David's going to have with Saul. Now, David likes Saul just fine and sees Saul as God's anointed king, and he is not going to do anything to cause problems with that or to try to harm Saul. But it doesn't work both ways. And we see this when the women who are shouting and dancing and singing about the great victory over the Philistines compliment Saul by saying he's killed his thousands, but then they turn and say, but David has killed his tens of thousands. Now, of course, they're exaggerating a bit at this point, but Saul is furious because he is jealous of David, and he sees David as a threat, even though he does not yet know that David is the one who Samuel has already anointed to take his place. And at first, Saul tries a number of different things, but there are a couple of times that he has a fit, meaning the unclean spirit comes upon him, while David is there, and David is playing the harp to try to soothe him. But on those two occasions, Saul takes his spear and tries to kill David. Well, the best thing I can guess on all of this is that David and the other people around must have thought that Saul was having a fit or a spell because of this, and that's what was controlling his mind, and that it wasn't something he actually wanted to do to David. What they didn't know is that, yes, Saul actually did. Now, maybe it's the fact that this unclean spirit was tormenting him and he was not able to resist his urge to harm David. But in any event, David is safe as a result of his being able to move quickly. Now, Saul had also done something else, and as David is able to avoid being killed or harmed, Saul becomes more and more afraid of him. One of the things he does is put David in charge of 1,000 soldiers and sends them out on military missions against the Philistines. And part of it's to get David away from him. Part of it is to get things accomplished, because it turns out David is very good at accomplishing his mission. And also, Saul starts thinking, well, maybe if I get the Philistines to kill him, then there won't be a problem. It'll solve my problem, and everything will be able to go on normally with me in charge, and there won't be a threat to me. Of course, Saul, by this time, knows that David is blessed by God. And so somehow he's thinking that he can overcome a blessing from God. But that's what he attempts to do. David has great success with this. Now, after the attempts Saul makes to try to kill David with a spear, David wises up, at least after the second time, and he gets out of there. The first time he goes out, and Saul's son Jonathan goes to David to get him to come back. Now, what had happened after Goliath had been killed, Jonathan got to know David, and these guys became best friends right away. They were not that close in age, but Jonathan saw what a good guy David was, and David could see that Jonathan was a really good guy. And so they made promises to each other, and Jonathan gave David a lot of gifts. And we're talking about things that would have been useful to David in his fighting, such as a sword and a bow. So these guys are real tight, and Jonathan's able to talk David into coming back to the court, and David's able to avoid getting killed that second time. And uh, Jonathan is deciding that, okay, maybe I need to talk with my dad about David and just see what he thinks about this, if he really does have something against David. Well, it seems that Saul knows just what to say. He knows that these guys are friends, and later on David will even tell Jonathan, hey, look, your dad knows we're friends, and he's going to tell you what he thinks you want to hear. Well, Jonathan doesn't want to believe these bad things about his own dad, and finally they set up kind of a test. And the way it works is this: Jonathan is going to go to the New Moon Festival. Now, the New Moon Festival was something that happened at the beginning of every month, and there were some religious parts of this, and there was a feast that was a part of this. And if you had done certain things, that would make you unclean, and you would not be able to participate in the event. And so they said, okay, on the first day, what we'll do is this. David, because he is still working for Saul in his capacity as a military commander, will show up. The head of the army shows up. Jonathan's going to be there because he's the son of the king, and Saul's going to be there. And there may be other people, but these were the important people. And so what they do is this: they have David not to show up the first night. And you can kind of explain that away and say, oh, maybe he was unclean for some reason, but he'll be here the second night. Well, the second night of the feast, David doesn't show up. And the plan is this: when Saul asked where David is, Jonathan was going to say, oh, he went to Bethlehem to be with his family, and he was going to have a sacrifice there. Something about his older brother is in charge now, and they were going to do that. And so they realized, Jonathan and David realized, that if Saul was not upset about David, then he'd say, okay. But he decided that he wanted that opportunity for David to be there so he could have him killed. Then he would get very angry because his plan had been messed up. Well, that's exactly what happened. The second one is that Saul got furious, and he insults his own son about this, and makes remarks about him being friends with David. And the prearranged signal was for Jonathan to go out, and David was going to be hiding in this field, and Jonathan was going to go out with this young boy and fire some arrows as if he were doing target practice. And he would call out to the boy where the arrows were, say, oh, come back this way, if it was okay and safe for David to come in. But if it were not safe for David to come back, he was going to tell the young boy, farther away, look for the arrows farther away. And so that's what they did. The young boy didn't know about this. Jonathan fired the arrows. Then he called out to the boy, oh, they're much farther away from you. Go quickly and you can get them. Well, the boy just knows, okay, here are the arrows. He goes and picks them up, comes back to them with for Jonathan, And Jonathan compliments him, hands him the bow, and asks him to take everything back for him. Meanwhile, he stays in the field, and maybe the signal from this, because it was that David needed to leave to save his life, maybe the signal was just for him to say that. But because of how furious his father had become and wanted to kill David, Jonathan had to see him. And this might very well be the last time. So he goes to David, and they're both crying about this because they're great friends. And probably they're never going to see each other again. And so they talk for a little while, and they promise each other some things. And Jonathan has some insight. He knows David's going to become the king. And he asks David to be friendly with his family, whatever happens. And David agrees to that, and he goes. Now, with this, we're just thinking, okay, David's leaving. It's pretty bad for him. But no, it's worse than this, because David had gotten married. Now, the whole thing about marrying the king's daughter, well, the first one he's offered to marry, he declines, and part of it is like, I'm not an important person, and this is the king's daughter. I really shouldn't marry her. And so Saul had married her off to somebody else. But then one of Saul's other daughters, or maybe the only other one, but the next one who was unmarried was Michal, and she loved David. And this time David's going, okay, this is great. I like her. I guess he loved her too, and he wanted to marry her. So there was some kind of, I'll say, sneaking around, although it wasn't a bad thing, where people were talking for Saul or talking for David and going back and forth and saying that, you really should marry her. And David's going, yeah, but I don't have the money, because in those days you had to pay a price to the bride's father for marrying his daughter. And so Saul saw an opportunity, and he goes, oh, just have David go out and kill 100 Philistines. Well, they're at war with the Philistines, so all right, he can do that. He's been doing that sort of thing all along. So David goes out to kill the 100 Philistines. And again, Saul's thinking, okay, maybe the Philistines can do the dirty work for me. No chance on that, because David ends up killing 200 Philistines and brings back the proof that he's done it. Well, Saul then has Michal marry David, and he, I guess, thinks he can keep an eye on David, but still, at one time, he sends some soldiers over to kill David in his house. Well, David had gotten away by climbing out the window, and his wife helped him get a head start on them. Well, David goes to Samuel the prophet, and what we see now is that David is going to be on the run for a long time, and Saul is going to be after him from time to time, trying to track down David and kill him. So I'm going to pause the story at this point, because things are going to change. But what we see now is that David, who has been doing nothing wrong, is having some bad things happen to him. And the lesson we learn from this is that sometimes when you're doing the right things, bad things will happen, because there will be people who don't like God and don't like seeing God's will done, and they may try to stop you. It's just to be sure that you're working for God, that you're doing things for Him, and don't worry about those people, even if it means you have to avoid dangerous situations. Okay, I'm going to let you go by showing you this tie, and this tie is showing a lot of runners on it. Now, in this case, it's only David, but soon there are going to be others with him. All right. I hope to see you next time. Until then, you have a great day. Bye.